Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Remastered running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, including having shadows pretty much disabled. There are still baked in shadows, but none of the dynamic shadows are active. This is of course running on the latest 22.8.1 beta drivers. So this is still not a full driver release, but it does have some patches over the previous beta driver. Now the level of performance that you're seeing here is of course with the system running at the stock 15 watt TDP, and at the full 1080p resolution we are struggling to keep a 60 FPS average, and the biggest downside here is of course those 1% lows. You look at the frame times though and things look relatively consistent, but there will be moments of spikes here and there. But as the mission progresses through, you are going to find moments where they're going to be stutters. It's certainly not the most unplayable experience, and I think a lot of people would be more than happy to play like this, but if you're someone used to playing Call of Duty games, you're probably used to a closer to 60 FPS gaming experience. Overall, it's not a bad time, especially since we are just at the stock 15 watt TDP. That is a very limited amount of power here, and what that actually ends up doing is you can see that the GPU itself is not running at its maximum clock speed. So in general, not exactly going to be amazing levels of performance, but the 1% lows are really just the biggest downside here, because our averages in general are relatively fine. But again, as things get more intense throughout the mission, it is going to end up causing some more problems. But really, it would be a stretch to say that this is a bad experience overall. Really, it's already very playable like this, and I think it bodes very well for how this is going to perform with different settings. Because of course, if we turn up the TDP up to 25 watts, and that is using the AMD APU tuning utility, it's linked down below in the description, and I also have a video showing you how to use it. I get asked about that a lot. It is down there in the description. I'll even link the video so you can actually figure out how to do it yourself. Warning, it does not work with every system, but for a lot of the systems that I have tested, it works perfectly fine, especially the most recent version, which seems to have just widened the compatibility with a wide assortment of systems. But overall, the level of performance that we do get out of this is more than reasonable here. But let's look at what the 25 watt TDP ends up doing, and you'll see running through the opening section here of this mission now with the 25 watt TDP, we actually do see a nice boost in the overall performance here. Specifically, the 1% lows now being in the 40 range and our averages now being in the 70 range does mean that we are having some pretty reasonable levels of performance here overall. But of course, the opening section is just the opening section. As things progress, things will fluctuate a bit more, but it won't be too dramatic. We'll jump ahead a few minutes into the actual mission just so that you could see some of the variety that ends up happening here. And you'll see that as we drive around the city in this scripted scene, the level of performance is still very consistent to where we were at the opening scene, and really in general the level of performance that we're getting out of this is more than reasonable. Again, the 1% lows could be better, but honestly you'll struggle to really find this to be an unplayable experience. This should be more than reasonable for most people, and most systems should be able to at least hit 25 watts in terms of TDP. Now if you live in a very hot region, it might not be doable, because of course your ambient temperatures are going to determine how much thermal headroom you really have here. If you're in an area that has, air conditioning or just a very cool climate, I don't know where in the world that would be right now, but really in general, if you're just with lower ambient temperatures, you're actually going to have more headroom to actually turn up the TDP. If you're in a hot environment, then really you're going to be limited to the stock 15 watt TDP, but the game was already very playable in that sense. This was just a nice little boost overall to the performance. But of course, we can go even further than this. We can go all the way up to 30 watts. And really, the 30 watt TDP actually does not end up netting us much of an improvement whatsoever. It's really around the same level of performance that we saw at the 25 watt TDP. So in general, it really just goes to show that the biggest jump in performance is going up to 25 watts. If you're just staying below that, you're going to have a little bit of trouble, and going over that is really kind of unnecessary. If you're on a system that can handle the TDP perfectly fine without actually getting into some pretty high temperatures, then by all means go ahead. But I don't think it's going to be worth it for most people, especially because most systems that actually have this chip are very low budget and aren't exactly built to have very robust cooling systems. So with that being said, I would really just recommend that you stick to the 25 watt TDP if you can, and if you can't go all the way up to that, then the 15 watt TDP is still going to be more than doable. But the 30 watt TDP just seems very, very unnecessary. Of course, that leaves us now with the option of turning down the resolution. If we do that, we might be able to actually net a bit of a performance increase without really having to turn up the TDP and risk having higher temperatures. So if you're someone that's limited to the 15 watt TDP, let's see what 900p actually gets you in terms of performance. In general, what 900p does at the 15 watt TDP is end up bringing the level of performance up to what the 25 watt TDP ended up being like. So you can actually get a nice boost in the overall gaming experience by just dropping the resolution down a slight bit, and you don't have to turn up the TDP and just increase the temperature and noise that your system is going to end up making. This particular system does get pretty loud and noisy when it starts to get into these higher TDPs, with the 30 watt TDP really bringing this thing to a screeching sound. So in general, not really something I would recommend for most people, and if you can avoid having to raise the TDP, then it's kind of worth it to do it. In the overall experience of gaming, though I am someone that doesn't use headphones all of the time, sometimes I like to just use speakers, and in those situations it does get very annoying to have a laptop there kind of just screeching at you. But in general, I'm very happy with the level of performance here, though there will be moments where it will dip down here and there. It is still in general around the level of performance that we saw at the 25 watt TDP. Of course, if we turn this up to the 25 watt TDP, then things actually start to get pretty interesting here, because our 1% lows are now at a range where it's very, very close to a 60 FPS range, with our averages going well above 80 FPS, going into the mid 80s. And that's actually really impressive levels of performance, because if we hook this up to an external monitor, we're now within the range of actually being able to utilize some high refresh rate gaming. Now, the fact that the 1% lows are below 60 pretty much takes a little bit away from that actual high refresh rate experience, but if you'll see, the FPS is actually consistently above 60 anyway. So really, the level of performance that we get out of this is really, really impressive. And overall, I'm just very happy to see this kind of result out of it, because again, we are turning up the TDP here and it is increasing the overall temperature, but not to an extreme degree, and it is getting you some nice level of performance. So I could totally see someone actually choosing to play like this to get a nice balance in terms of FPS without having to sacrifice too much in terms of resolution. Of course, we can also look at what the 30 watt TDP ends up doing in this situation, and really it seems to be about an improvement over where we're at right now. You'll see that our FPS will sometimes go into the hundreds, but in general it stays around a 80 to 90 FPS range. Really, it just feels super nice to play, and as things progress throughout the mission, it stays consistently rock solid, but it's not a major improvement over the 25 watt TDP. Now, if we skip ahead a little bit, you can see here that the performance pretty much stays consistent throughout the entirety of this mission. There are really no noticeable issues throughout all of this, and you'll see that those frame times are staying rock solid. So really good levels of performance, but the temperature that we're getting is just excessive, and the performance increase doesn't really seem to be that great over the 25 watt TDP, and the temperature increase is very noticeable. So again, 30 watt TDP doesn't really seem necessary for this game in this scenario. I would really just avoid that and kind of just stick with 25 watts at the most. Of course, you can drop the game down to 720p if you want, but honestly, in general, at this point, we're already getting very good levels of performance, and the performance was already good at the 1080p resolution, so going down to 720p just seems very unnecessary. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I don't really think I'm going to show you 720p. I did record it, but I feel like in general, it's going to be kind of redundant information. So overall, what do I recommend? I recommend that if you're stuck at the stock 15 watt TDP, you just power through at the way that it's at. The level of performance that you're going to get is still going to be more than reasonable enough, but if you are someone that is very sensitive to FPS, dropping down to 900p is going to probably be worth it. And I will let you know that at 720p, there was really not that much of an improvement really overall at the stock 15 watt TDP, that the resolution drop is really unnecessary, because there wasn't any major improvement in the 1% lows, and that's really what you want to see an improvement in. So in general, 900p is probably the way to go if you want to maximize your FPS that you actually end up getting at the stock 15 watt TDP without sacrificing too much in terms of visual quality. If you're going all the way up to the 25 watt TDP, then honestly, you can just stay at 1080p and have a very enjoyable experience. 900p at that point is really unnecessary unless you want to hit some low high FPS gaming numbers numbers, but really not very necessary overall. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.